Hello and welcome to Topic 6, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to look at contraceptive policy. Okay, so with Topic 6, we start the exploration of public policy. Finally, yay! But it was good that we did all that foundational work. And keep in mind, this is the last topic that we cover before the midterm exam. And so, just as a reminder, you will receive the exam questions on October 25th. There will also be a study session on that day on Zoom. It'll be recorded if you can't make it. And then the exam itself is due on October 31st, so you have some time to work on it. So this topic, Topic 6, examines the public debates and policies associated with reproduction. And so we're going to be learning about the policies associated with contraception, that is the means that a person may use to prevent pregnancy. And this topic will examine abortion policy, that is the termination of a pregnancy. Now, Lecture 1, the one that you're listening to right now, is focused on the different phases of the contraception policy that historically that we've seen in the United States. The Lecture 2, it provides sort of a broad look at the right to privacy. And I will leave it to you to read about the phases of abortion policy in the textbook. So that's kind of what we got on the docket for this week. So let's go ahead and get started. So as you're going to learn this week, since the 1960s and 70s until just recently with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, people have had the tools to manage and control their reproduction. In other words, that people could have sex with delinked from reproduction. That given the multiple birth control methods, the pill, most of which can be very reliable, and also access to abortion as a constitutional right, that when people had sex, that they could have it for reasons other than reproducing. And in fact, you could have sex for pleasure because you could control your reproduction, and you didn't have to worry necessarily about the getting pregnant as a result of sexual activities or intercourse in particular. So 19th century feminists referred to this control over reproduction as voluntary motherhood. And they regarded voluntary motherhood as essential for women achieving freedom and equality. Voluntary motherhood is this idea that women bring themselves to being mothers. They choose to become pregnant. And they also can control not becoming a mother, right? That they can have control over that. Today, we talk about that not as voluntary motherhood, but as planned parenthood, right? That you plan when you want to become a parent. And that's true for women and for men in relationships. You can use technology in order to plan when you want your pregnancies to be, for the most part, right? And for the 19th century feminists, they really saw this as essential for women achieving freedom and equality. That it's difficult to, pursue your dreams, to go to school, to get a job that you want, if there's a lot of uncertainty regarding whether or not you're going to get pregnant. But realizing, so this idea of voluntary motherhood has been around, since the 1800s. But realizing voluntary motherhood, realizing this control over reproduction is a relatively new phenomenon. For most of American history, released prior to the 1960s, women and families had little reliable and safe control over reproduction. And as I was preparing my lectures for today, these are my first sets of lectures post-Dobbs, I'm realizing that we may be entering an era of not voluntary motherhood or voluntary parenthood, but involuntary motherhood, involuntary parenthood. And so we may be entering we are entering an era of diminished control over reproductive freedom. So your textbook identifies 3 phases of public policy that reflect how contraception is defined by society. And because of recent changes, I've added a 4th phase, which we'll talk about just briefly in the lecture. Phase 1 is contraception is viewed as obscene material by public policy. Phase 2, contraception as a preventative treatment of disease. Phase 3, contraception as tool for family planning, personal choice. And phase 4, potential erosion of constitutional protection of right to contraceptives. So let's take a look at these phases. So prior to the 19th century, and so that would be prior to the 1800s, that contraception was viewed as a private matter. In other words, it wasn't viewed as a realm for public policymakers or lawmakers to get involved. Contraception and the use of contraceptives was practiced, as it has been for most of human history, if not all of human history, but it wasn't seen as a matter of public debate or policy. And that was in large part to what we've talked about in the past, this idea of separate spheres, right? That women possessed a certain sphere, and that was the family, the sphere of family, home, and the private realm. And men were involved in the public realm, right? And so not that the public realm didn't get involved in some aspects of the private realm. I mean, for example, in marriage, where women lost their legal identity when they got married. I mean, clearly that was an entry into the private realm. But, most sort of, matters of sexuality or reproduction sort of left to something, an arena that public lawmakers didn't get involved in. That does, like I said, it doesn't mean that contraceptives weren't practiced and used. Of course they were. That there's a long history of sort of home methods of contraceptives, whether that's herbal washes or of the vaginal area after sex that would be seen as sort of having a spermicidal impact. Barriers, cotton wrapped in honey that would serve as a barrier to the cervix. The rhythm method, monitoring one's when people felt that they were fertile or coitus interruptus, right? All of those were methods that were practiced, but clearly outside of the realm of public control. This changes in the 1830s. Okay. And so at the beginning part of the 19th century, that there's growing concern about the access and distribution of contraceptives. And this is in part due to what was known as the rubber revolution, which is kind of like that has a double meaning. That condoms are sometimes referred to as rubber. They're not made out of rubber anymore, unless latex is rubber. Maybe it is. I'm not sure. But that sheaths used as condoms from animal skins, those were used, but they weren't very reliable prior to the 1830s. But Charles Goodyear, a chemist, that he came up with a method of what was known as vulcanizing rubber, changing rubber so that it was more durable and that it could be mass produced. And that invention led to the easier access and the mass production of contraceptives. So not only did it make rubber condoms easier to access and easier to produce, but diaphragms became easier to have access to, and other types of contraceptives that utilized this vulcanized rubber were used. And yes, if that name sounds familiar, Charles Goodyear, he wasn't the founder of the Goodyear Tire Company, but when that tire company was formed, they named it after Charles Goodyear. So we have this rise of the use of contraceptives at the early part of the 19th century. It's in the mid 19th century, around the 1860s, that contraception begins to enter the public debate. And the driving force behind making contraceptives a public issue is Anthony Comstock, who is pictured there. So who's Anthony Comstock? Well, Anthony Comstock was born in 1844. He was raised as a strict Puritan, very religious upbringing. He fought in the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, he took a job in New York City. And when he was in New York City in the 1860s, the mid 1860s, he began to see what life was like in New York City. He was confronted with gambling halls and saloons and easy access to pornography and brothels and prostitution. And he was just appalled by what he saw as the moral degradation of America. And he really thought that this moral degradation was brought on by access to pornography, being able to engage in sexual pleasure because you had access to contraceptives, and that he was really, really concerned about this. And also for him, it was personal. Like I said, he was raised religiously devout, but in his own writings, he talks about his own sexual desires, and that he says that he is, I'm not making this up, that he views himself as sort of a compulsive masturbator, and that he feels like this dark side of him is really brought out by having access to pornography and having access to brothels. And so he really wanted to bring all of that to an end. And so he gets involved in politics. He joins the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and he works with them to bring about and create anti-vice commissions within the city of New York, drawing attention to all the vice that's going on. He also, as it says here, he begins to lobby Congress to do something about this, problem, right? So Anthony Comstock, he's a problem identifier. He's an agenda setter. He's like, there's this problem. There's all this moral degrading lewdness going on in these sittings. And the reason that it's going on in these cities is because people have access to contraceptives and information about contraceptives and pornography and brothels, and we've got to do something about it. So he lobbies Congress to pass a law criminalizing the importation and distribution of obscene materials, and that included information and about contraceptives and actually contraceptives themselves. So I want you also to just think about the mindset too at this time, that, when you get contraceptives, it has a pamphlet, at least back in the day, and even today to a certain degree, showing you how to use it, how to insert it, how it should be used, right? And that, that seeing that information was seen as sort of like obscene, sexually provocative. And so that was what he wanted Congress to take action on that. So the first contraceptive policy in the United States is known as the Comstock Act, named after Anthony Comstock. And it defines contraceptives as an obscene and illicit material, making it a federal offense to disseminate birth control through the mail or across state lines. And so that this is a federal law. And so the federal government has control over importation of items into the United States. And so the importation of contraceptives from other countries was prohibited. You could not use the mail to distribute contraceptives and information about contraceptives because the United States has control over the Postal Service. And you can't distribute them or between state lines. You can't cross state lines and basically deliver any sort of contraceptives between state lines because the United States government has control over interstate commerce. Okay, and so this was a really comprehensive law that had an impact not just on contraceptives, but had impact on any items that were regarded as obscene and illicit. They were known as the chastity laws because we were trying to bring social purity back to the United States by prohibiting the distribution of these sorts of items. Now, this is a federal law, so it was limited in terms of its reach, right? You couldn't send things through the mail, you couldn't transport it between states, you couldn't import contraceptives into the United States. But within a state, you could manufacture and distribute contraceptives, because what happens in the state is not the jurisdiction, at least not at this time, of the federal government. And so states began to pass what were known as Little Comstock Acts. And these were state versions of the federal law that made it a criminal offense to distribute contraceptives, to give out information about contraceptives, contraceptives. And so, the states followed suit with implementation of their own laws. And because of both the federal law and the 24 state level laws, access to contraceptives became very difficult in the United States. And so the first policy is to crack down on access to contraceptives. Just as a side note, Anthony Comstock got a job out of this. So because he brought this to the attention of the United States government, they passed the law, and then they gave him a commission as special agent to the U.S. Post Office, because it was the post office that was in large part, monitoring and enforcing the law, since it was a federal crime to use the mail to mail contraceptives to people in the United States. The Comstock Acts made it much more difficult for people to access contraceptives and to get information about contraceptives. And that made some people in the United States really angry, particularly women who really saw that the ability to, have control over your reproduction was really a key to becoming a more equal and free individual within the United States. And one of those people was Margaret Sanger. You might be familiar with Margaret Sanger. She is sometimes known as the founding mother of Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger was a nurse, that she was a sex educator. She was a birth control activist. And for her, she really was, with those 19th century feminists who were basically saying, look, control of your reproduction is really key to women's liberation. And following the Comstock Act, she really saw and was witness as a nurse to the hardships that were associated with not choosing to become a mother, not choosing to become a parent. And in fact, she writes a whole book that includes letters from women who wrote her about the real harms that come from not having control over one's reproductive capacity. So as I stated, for Sanger, controlling reproduction is really key for her to equality and freedom. Like other feminists at this time period, she really believed that women can't achieve equality and personal autonomy within the United States if they can't plan their pregnancies. That she wanted voluntary motherhood, not involuntary motherhood. And so Margaret Sanger challenged the Comstock Act. And she did that by opening the first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916. And so by opening a birth control clinic, she was in complete opposition to, or she was, offending the Comstock Act because she was basically engaging in a criminal act according to that law. And she was charged, convicted, and sentenced of violating the Comstock Act. And so that she had a trial, and she received a sentence of 30 days in jail. And through the trial and the publicity that the trial got, it really drew attention to this problem of involuntary motherhood, this problem associated with not having control over one's reproductive capacity. And so just as Anthony Comstock was identified a problem and got it on the agenda, so too did Margaret Sanger. She identified the problem of involuntary motherhood, and she got it on the agenda because of the publicity that her trial received. So Margaret Sanger challenges the Comstock Act, but it's unsuccessful. In fact, she's convicted and put in jail. And so she realizes that the approach that she's using to challenge the Comstock Act is not successful. That she realizes that if she wants to change the law, focusing on that having control of your reproduction is essential for women's freedom and equality, she realizes that that is not an argument that's going to get traction in changing public policy. And so what she does is that she shifts her perspective. And the shift in perspective that she has is that let's not focus on women, but let's focus on the right of male doctors to treat patients, okay? And that she says that if we can find medical loopholes within the Comstock Act, basically say you can have the Comstock Act. However, we have to carve out exceptions for doctors so that they can treat patients. That if you find these loopholes and you carve out exceptions within the Comstock Act, that it's going to weaken that Comstock Act. And in fact, that is an approach that was really worked quite successfully. So why is the approach, the medical loophole approach, why is that successful to weakening the Comstock Act? Well, it's successful in part because it appealed to two powerful interests within society. Clearly, one of those was doctors. You're looking for a medical loophole, a way that doctors can get an exemption from the Comstock Act. Well, doctors were a powerful group in society at this time. In the 20th century, we begin to see the professionalization of medical doctors, the formation of the American Medical Association, and the sense that doctors should be the ones who are making decisions about their patients, not Congress. And so doctors got on board with that and were happy to lobby Congress on in terms of more freedom for doctors. Doctors said, look, birth control can be seen as a therapeutic. If a woman has a health condition that would be exacerbated by getting pregnant, then doctors should be able to prevent that pregnancy. If you're able to distribute contraceptives, you can make money from distributing those contraceptives to your patients. And also there was money to be made in future research on contraceptives, right? If people use contraceptives, you get a more effective form of contraceptive like the pill, there's money that can be made. And indeed money was made in the production of the pill. Another powerful interest in society at this time were nativists, or those who were they were anti-immigrant, anti-immigration. As we know, there was a rise of immigration at the beginning of the 20th century from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Northern Europe. And as those people came into the United States, there was a backlash to that, sort of similar to the backlash that we have today. There was a sense that these weren't true Americans, and that when they would come and have a lot of babies, that it was basically, degrading the purity of the true Americans in the United States. So Sanger appealed to the nativist sentiment that in order to achieve this goal of getting rid of the Comstock Act. And so rise of immigrants in the 20th century was viewed negatively. Hey, you want to keep the immigrant population low, allow access to birth control, give birth control to immigrants, and therefore they'll stop reproducing and real Americans can reproduce and keep the population pure. As you're going to see throughout the course of this semester, that sometimes feminists like Margaret Sanger will align with us, a less than appropriate group like anti-immigrants to achieve what they see as this bigger goal of achieving reproductive freedom or other goals for women. And it's an example of a policy community that we talked about when we were learning about the public policy process, that doctors and nativists formed a network of political actors who were lobbying Congress to change or make exceptions to the Comstock Act. And that there were legal challenges that arise to the Comstock Act, basically really weakening its impact. It allowed women to use birth control for therapeutic reasons, that doctors can use the mail in order to distribute birth control for medical reasons. And so you can really see that really begins to chip away at the power of the Comstock Act. So the Comstock Act, that federal law is weakened, but the little Comstock Acts are still in place in many states, thus making the distribution and use of birth control a crime. And so that at this point, we sort of see a return to Sanger's original goal. That is that birth control equals freedom for women and families. As it says there, that sort of brings us into this phase 3, that contraception is a tool for family planning and personal choice. And the 1960s is a fertile time for this period, in particular, since there is many advances in terms of different types of birth control that women can use. Now, Planned Parenthood is at the forefront of shifting the terms of the debate back towards liberty, privacy, and autonomy, this phase 3 of contraceptive policies. And it's really that the phase 3 is really achieved with Griswold versus Connecticut. And in the other lecture that we're going to be listening to this week, you'll see that there is a much more detailed discussion of broadly the right to privacy and the case Griswold versus Connecticut. So I'll let you listen to that on that separate lecture, but just keep that in mind, that that's the important role that Griswold plays in the third phase of contraceptive policy. So what is the next phase in contraceptive policy considering the Dobbs decision? And the Dobbs decision, we're going to be talking about it more in the next lecture, is the decision that overturns Roe v. Wade and says that you don't have a constitutional right to an abortion. So is the next phase going to be a potential erosion of the constitutional protections of the right to contraceptives that is established in Griswold versus Connecticut? At this point, it's unclear. We're not sure what the next phase is going to look like. In the Dobbs decision written by Justice Samuel Alito, he specifies that there is that even though there is no constitutional right to an abortion, that does not apply to other rights based on the right to privacy, such as the right to contraceptive use. And so he basically says that just because you don't have a right to an abortion doesn't mean that you don't have a constitutional right to the use of contraceptives. But some people are wondering, is that really the case? The right to an abortion is predicated on the constitutional right to privacy. So if the constitutional right to privacy doesn't extend to, in fact, not only does the constitutional right not extend to abortion, but the court says that there is no constitutional right to privacy, right? That's not in the Constitution, right? So it leaves people to think that if the right to privacy doesn't apply to abortion because the right to privacy doesn't exist, does that mean that without the right to privacy in the Constitution, do you actually have a constitutional right to use abortions? Now, it could very well be that, states aren't chomping at the bit to pass Comstock Act style laws, from the 1880s, right? While there is political will to criminalize abortion, there's not really a political will, at least that I'm aware of, to criminalize broad and general use of contraceptives. But that being the case, that even if broadly used contraceptives such as diaphragms, condoms, the pill are left intact, it could be that certain types of contraceptives that prevent a fertilized egg from implanting in a uterus, it's possible that there might be laws passed at the state level saying that certain contraceptives such as the IUD, which prevents that implantation of a fertilized egg into the uterus, as does Plan B, it could be that states could criminalize access, use, distribution of these types of contraceptives. But like I said, at this point, we don't know what the next phase of contraceptive policy is going to be. But if you're interested, it's something that you could explore on your own, and also, think about a potential idea for a public policy paper. Okay, thanks a lot for listening, and on to our next lecture, which is on abortion rights.